Michael Shellenberger is the University of Austin CBR Chair in Politics, Censorship and Free Speech. In a distinguished career spanning through environmentalism, politics and journalism, Michael has emerged as one of the world's foremost advocates against censorship and for the proliferation of free speech and public debate. Most recently, Michael's been at the forefront of reporting from Brazil, where extraordinary attempts are underway to censor Elon Musk's X platform at the risk of great financial penalty. Michael joined us here in Austin to talk about these attempts, to talk about his work in the free speech space, and to offer some hope for the future students of the University of Austin. Please enjoy this interview. Michael Shellenberger, you're the University of Austin CBR Chair in Politics, Censorship and Free Speech. You're really one of the strongest voices for free speech, for the anti-censorship movement in the world today, broadly speaking. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, how you came to occupy this really important space, and maybe how you've arrived at the University of Austin after this wonderful career.
Well, sure. So I find myself a little surprised to be a free speech advocate. It was never something I felt needed to be advocated for. I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 1971. In 1977, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the right of neo-Nazis, or I guess Nazis, to march through a neighborhood not just of mostly Jewish Americans, but of Holocaust survivors. That was something that I probably wasn't 6 years old. My father told me that story, but I remember hearing about it, right. And it was a part of the lore of the United States and of the First Amendment. And I think I came from, my parents were very progressive. I was definitely a kid on the radical left. And at that time, the left was very pro-free speech. And it was something that really, I think, bound together what you might consider more radical left and more just liberal left, FDR left type people in the United States. You get to 1989, the year I graduated from high school, and the Supreme Court rules that people have a right to burn the American flag. And on that issue, it was progressives, liberals who were on the side of the right to burn, and conservatives who were against it. So for me, free speech was always a liberal issue. I mean, both in the sense of liberal, liberal values, but I think even more broadly on the political left. Never something I really thought about. In 2020, my book Apocalypse Never came out. I've been really focused on the environment for the last 20, 25 years. But then Facebook censored a post about my book, and everything in what I wrote was accurate. And it was a really shocking experience for me, a really horrible experience. It really felt degrading. And then it kind of went asleep for a little bit. I saw that Twitter had deplatformed Trump in January 2021, and I thought, this doesn't seem quite right. If you're a presidential candidate, or if you're president and you're being deplatformed. But then it was really the December 2022 when Barry Weiss, a co-founder of University of Austin, brought me into the Twitter files, and then I realized that this was really two things going on. On the one hand, there's what we call cancel culture, something from within the culture demanding the censorship of people so they can't speak. But then there was the involvement of the government, and that's where things took a very interesting turn.
Right, that's interesting. I guess if you're dealing with things like neo-Nazis, burning the American flag, there's a sense in which those things are very obvious, right? Like you can understand why people might have a predilection to saying, whoa, okay, we have to put some boundaries up here. But I think that the kind of work that you're doing is getting to a place that's much more nuanced, that's kind of looking at a very, very deep foundational level. What are the consequences for a society in which we censor? A society in which the government has, too much power to stop people hearing and seeing. Right. So the question I have is, as a student, say coming into the University of Austin or any other major American university, do you think that kids today are kind of equipped to realize what the stakes are? I mean, I can understand we can see black and white, what's good, what's bad, perhaps on a basic level, but how much training, how much cultivation, how much education does a young person need to really understand what's at play in the free speech domain? today?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question. So there's been a big generational change, and a lot of people have written about it, particularly young people raised on social media. We've seen, I think the evidence is now pretty clear. I agree with the mainstream view of this, that social media has increased anxiety. It's created that fishbowl effect where you feel like everybody's watching me and you're feeling a lot of anxiety about that. I think it also has created a kind of dogmatism around certain ideas, so that people are reinforced in those ideas. And then when someone suggests a different idea, then it's treated by many people as something immoral, that somebody would have a different view than them, and even as a sort of act of violence. And so you sort of see words being treated as acts of violence, and which is very, very dangerous for a lot of different reasons, one of which is that it actually sort of relativizes real-world violence. And so that sharper distinction that we used to have between speech and real-world violence, it feels like, is breaking down at a lot of different levels. But I think that, there was a kind of... I look back now, and I think the thing that seemed natural to me was not. I did learn why. In other words, when you hear that they're letting Nazis march through neighborhoods of mostly Jewish Americans, I think it's quite natural to ask, well, why would we do that? Why would you allow that to occur? And so you have to get into some explanations there. And there's sort of one explanation, which is just, well, because everybody has a right to say what they think and they have a right to assemble. Now, that does not give you a right to threaten somebody with violence. That is where the line has been drawn. In other words, there is a point where speech can become violence, and it's where you get into a place of threat or you're using language to organize real-world violence. But it turns out that that's actually pretty easy to recognize. I think sometimes people think that they kind of go, well, it's a very thin line, but it's a pretty bright line. I think in most cases, at least the courts have tended to find that. And so I do think, though, that there was some amount of education that I received that I don't think younger Americans are receiving around why it is that we allow the First Amendment and free speech. One of the most important is that it's actually how we overcome prejudice and hatred. And it's actually how we overcome bad information. And it was funny because I was on a totally separate topic. I was viewing a house here in Austin that we're renovating, and the architect said, we're going to put out a bunch of ideas, including a bunch of bad ideas that you're not going to like, because that's going to help you figure out what you do like. And I was like, well, this is why I'm a free speech advocate,
really?
is because
free speech and housing design
exactly
is a useful thing as well.
I mean, how many of us know that the experience of being creative is a process of being like surfacing bad ideas or half-baked ideas? Ideas never come fully formed. So I think there's some of that, and then I've just been inspired lately by this character, Daryl Davis. He's an African-American blues musician who has converted at least 200 KKK members to give up their robes by just having this very human conversation with them in person. And he's now a huge free speech advocate. He says, no, please, you must let hate speech exist. You must have hate speech, because otherwise there's no chance for you to argue against it or allow people to see you, to humanize you and see you as a human being.
Right, that's fascinating. I think it speaks to the point, Daryl Davis, that civil discourse, putting opinions in a humane and decent way, and encouraging people around to the truth, may be better than sort of bullying your way to your truth, which is I think something that's increasingly pernicious in the United States, certainly around the Western world. Your influence has really grown recently, to encompass, I would say, the world of free speech and censorship, broadly speaking. One of the most incredible news stories has been what's happening in Brazil and the Brazilian government's actions against X, Twitter. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what's happening in Brazil, and why is this such a significant story for the world writ large right now?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing about Brazil is it's a massive country. It's larger than the continental United States. It, of course, encompasses most of the Amazon. It's a major power. Huge beef and soy exports to China. It's coming very close to China, which is a huge source of concern and debate. And it had a dictatorship from the 60s to the 80s, about 20 years. And then they have a new constitution that came in 89, and then they had their first direct presidential elections, I believe, in 92. So it's a young democracy to some extent. They have a republic, 2 houses of Congress, and then a Supreme Court that also then controls what's called a high electoral court. Well, basically what happens is they elect a very like figure in 2018 named Jair Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
And the reaction to Bolsonaro is just eerily identical to the reaction
Right.
here. There's an overreaction. And there was also then, we saw a series of efforts to censor what they call misinformation, but also hate speech, very similar justifications, and very similar types of behaviors and strategies. And the main difference with Brazil versus, say, the United States or Europe is that the people that are imposing the censorship are in the judicial system rather than in the executive branch, which is how it is in most parts of the world. And what occurred is that I have a long relationship with Brazil. I was there. I interviewed the current president of Brazil 30 years ago. I lived there. I learned Portuguese. I was on the left. I was a big fan of the current political party that's in power. Anyway, long story short, I was going to give a talk there a couple of weeks ago at a free speech event. And I have two Brazilian colleagues. We had done 2 pieces for our publication, Public. They said, can you please look into the Twitter files and see if you can find anything? I thought I had already, but sort of at the last minute, just trying to go there and be able to give something to the Brazilians, I found more. And we just published, as soon as I landed, right from the airport to my hotel room, and we published the Twitter files Brazil. And at that point, basically, just chaos for the next 10 days. And now we're in the midst of U.S. congressional investigations.
Right.
It really became one of the most shocking episodes of censorship and the revelations of the censorship.
Right. The thing I find really interesting, you see again and again the pretext of emergency, right, being something that's used to justify censorship. You see that just in the manner that Hitler came to power. National emergency. You see it on a small scale, when you need to turn a company's attention to something. Some things have to be, okay, we can't worry about the rules anymore. I think we certainly see that in the aftermath to the election of Donald Trump, that the republic is in danger. With the approach of the 2020 election, as you've written fantastically about, along with the New York Post and others, there was this kind of deliberate attempt to cultivate an existential crisis, which then justifies the suspension of free speech norms. Is there anything you can say about that? Is that something that you recognize pretty consistently in all the issues that you deal with, or are there ways that people can get away with censorship without kind of creating the emergency?
That's a great, what you said is totally accurate, and you described it really well. In fact, I still get chills up my spine when you describe the historical parallels and how totalitarians take power by creating emergencies and fear, and trying to learn from that, because clearly that is what's going on. And we've observed there's definitely an organic demand for censorship. That's cancel culture.
Right.
But after 2016, with the election of Trump, after Brexit that same year, and then after Bolsonaro in Brazil, there's clearly an inorganic or governmental response. You call it a deep state in the sense that it's coming from parts of the government that were not elected, very powerful bureaucracies that are clearly abusing their powers and often going far beyond what the law allows, and interfering in elections, and it's ongoing. And so, that's a big part of it. And that's the part whenever I get really, because there's a way in which cancel culture is familiar. Like, I think in some ways we know how to deal with it. It's not to say that people are dealing with it, but you deal with it by saying, no, we're going to allow that speaker to speak, and we're going to have security to make sure that it's safe. And it's pretty straightforward. But what do you do when you start to see all these government agencies plus government funded NGOs, which are clearly acting in concert with the government, basically demanding the repression of their fellow citizens? It's a really scary, creepy feeling. And what we obviously have been doing is you have to expose it on the one hand, and then you have to. I found myself in Brazil. On the one hand, we exposed the censorship industrial complex, And then on the other hand, I spent a lot of time talking to people about why you should not censor speech you disagree with about elections, and they would often give very clear examples. What happens if somebody is telling you that the election is on a different date, for example?
Right.
And my answer is always the same, which is, well, then there's a chance that you would go out and say that that's wrong and that this is the correct date for elections. And the government certainly should be saying what the proper date is for the elections. So some random person on the internet says that's not the date, and the government elections office says this is the date. I think people are going to be okay. Clearly, what we're seeing was people using election misinformation as an excuse to censor particular politicians and journalists who are clearly on the populist right. Now, there is some exceptions of the populist left being censored. Particularly, there's a radical communist group in Brazil that was censored. But it's clearly an effort by elites to censor what you would call populist voices.
Right. So let me ask you then, a lot of these authoritarian instincts, a lot of the diaspora of government organizations, look at someone like Elon Musk and say, well, that's the real threat. That's the person that we've got to stop. But I think you and others really saw Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter as, almost as kind of like a heroic moment for the pursuit of truth. Do you have any view on what the significance of that might be? Because that was an enormous transaction, right? But the consequences are not just financial, not just commercial.
No. I think it's historic. It's something that we're in, I guess, a year and a half since he opened up the Twitter files. And I didn't fully understand what was going on. And to be honest with you, I think I still didn't quite understand the significance of it until just now in Brazil. Right. So, at first what happens is we discover that, yes, there had been widespread ideological censorship by Twitter of mostly conservative and populist voices. We found people on blacklists. We also found, some prestigious elites, Harvard's Martin Killdorf, Stanford's Jay Bhattacharya on literal blacklists inside of Twitter because of their views on COVID. Over time, we saw that there was incredible government pressure and influence on Twitter, including a lot of former government officials in Twitter, including former FBI officials involved in what I think we would call information operations, to basically censor the Hunter Biden laptop story, to deplatform President Trump, and to engage in a lot of those things. So there's a legitimate concern around Elon Musk, which is that he has very other powerful financial interests, including in China, including in India, and around Turkey, and around the world. Well, I have happened to look at these situations, and he says, he wants to be in all these countries, and he's going to have to follow the local laws. He would prefer to have First Amendment levels, but he wants to be in countries because it's better to be in countries than not be in them. Take one example of Turkey. The government demanded censorship. He complied because they were under this incredible legal pressure. I looked into it, and I discovered, because I had access to Twitter files, that in fact it was an ongoing problem in Turkey. And he did the right thing, which was he published the government's request for censorship, which is a very clever response to censorship. Similarly, on Brazil, we discovered that there had been ongoing efforts to censor particular voices by this powerful Supreme Court justice in particular on Twitter. I published the Twitter files, and I think it was 3 days later that Elon basically said things are out of control in Brazil. They're going beyond what the law allows. The Supreme Court justice is acting like a dictator. His name is Alexandre de Moraes. And Elon was clearly triggered by the Twitter files that we had published, but it was also obvious that there had been, these processes were still happening. I mean, they'd open up these censorship cases and they'd be arguing about it for years. So for me, it was a very dramatic moment because it showed that he was willing to stand up to governments, and not just privately through the official legal channels, but publicly. And this is a person who now has, I believe, 180 million followers on Twitter, and basically he'll tweet, one word and it becomes national news. So I feel that really, until he bought Twitter, there's a way in which we really didn't have free speech, in the sense that the public couldn't really speak or go viral in the ways that you are able to now. That was repressed under the Twitter before he bought it. It's now available. And so when people criticize him, people are attacking him. And I think it's really important to understand that the majority of those criticisms are that he's allowing more free speech.
Right.
And that's the crux of it. So people really betray what they want when you're attacking Elon Musk for allowing free speech. That means you're advocating censorship, even if you're not going to be so explicit as to say so.
Right. Michael, let me ask you, one of the big debates around platforms like Twitter, Facebook, is that these places, whether it happened in the last year or the last decade, have essentially become the public square. You mentioned, we didn't really have free speech in that sense until Elon Musk made it possible, and that would imply that, Twitter is the public square now. Facebook is the public square. We live most of our lives, or maybe not most, but a significant portion of our lives online. Certainly for some people, it is most of their interactions are on platforms. Can you help us understand, what's a private company and what's the public square? Where did we kind of cross that boundary? And if we crossed that boundary, how did the rules change when that happened? I mean, was there like a hard line, or is there some nuance to it? What's private and what's public, and who's a publisher and who's not?
Well, these are all the right questions. These are the questions that, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court is wrestling with, the Brazilian Supreme Court, the European Union. So this is the main event. So I think it's worth pointing out that the town square picture is a picture of a small community, and there really is much more open access to it, assuming that the king or the mayor or the city council, whoever's in charge, is allowing free speech there. By the time you get to mass society, you really have a couple of phases. I'm going to overly simplify it, but you would sort of say from the mid 1800s to 1950. You have a huge number of newspapers. In the United States, you have communist, fascist, corporate, right-wing, all these different kinds of newspapers, and people would read multiple papers. The New York Times then ushered in a period of kind of respectability and of a more mainstream model after World War II. And so you've got you get two dynamics. One is the newspapers became more consolidated, and you had a lot of consolidations and control. And then you also had radio and TV, which has limited bandwidth, which is given out by the government. So you really see from, I think, 1945 until arguably 2016, an incredible, or 2015, an incredible control by a small group of people around what is acceptable and what's inside, where the Overton window is. That's the description of what's legitimate debate. Well, then you get to 2016, the revolutions of 2016. First, I think it's worth pointing out, most mainstream political scientists don't think that Donald Trump won the presidency because of social media, and I agree with them. He won in the Republican debates on Fox and other channels, and then there's a variety of reasons why he won the general election, but I don't think social media was part of it. Nevertheless, I think the evidence is now overwhelming that a lot of elites, by which I mean corporate elites, media elites, and governmental elites, including these deep state actors I was describing, all decided that they needed to get control over social media again. And so you saw incredible efforts from 2016 to 2020 by governments in the United States, Brazil, and Europe to reimpose control over the social media platforms. And they were succeeding until you get to Musk's purchase of X in 2022. Now, Facebook has abandoned its principled free speech position. It abandoned it in really 2019, 2020. As a result of an intense boycott on their advertisers. 2017, Mark Zuckerberg said, I'm not responsible for Brexit and Trump, and I'm, Jewish, and I support the right of Holocaust deniers to spout their opinions on my platform. You get to 3 years later, and he had abandoned that position. And he got so frustrated with the political demands that he's basically repressed all news, so news doesn't go viral on Facebook anymore. So you're really left with X, and I think people should be scared by that. I mean, I am very grateful that Elon has made it more of a free speech platform, but I think that we need to have a free speech platform, and we shouldn't depend on a single person. We do now, and I have proposed and testified before Congress that the rule should be that if you have what's called Section 230, which is this special liability protections for what are called interactive computer services, which we call social media platforms, but also Google search. I think if you're going to have that, then you have to let adult users decide how to moderate and choose their own legal content. And if you're going to be a publisher, like I'm a publisher, then you can censor and publish whatever you want. But if you're going to get the special liability protections, I think you should have an obligation to let the users decide what they're able to see.
Right. So a lot of what you're saying kind of paints the picture of maybe a ruling class or a media elite that's kind of gotten out of control. When I see our incoming students here, they look at newspapers, whether it's the New York Times or any of the other legacy institutions, and I think they're inherently distrustful. Our kids are inherently distrustful of these places. They don't perhaps revere them in the way your average university student, maybe even 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, would. You mentioned 1945 forward, this sort of growth of the mainstream media, so to speak, of like a kind of unified industry. I guess having something like that depends upon an elite that is virtuous, an elite that takes seriously its responsibility to tell the truth and to lead with honor. Where do you see that elite now? I know you've touched on this already. Do you see any signs of regrowth, regeneration, a sort of a recapturing of honor in the media, or are we kind of on this nihilistic slope where control is tightening and any instinct for the truth is being further extinguished? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, definitely the latter. I mean, look, just in the while I was in Brazil, Barry Weiss's Free Press published the story about an NPR reporter who described how there's basically zero Republicans, almost zero conservatives at NPR. NPR's own, like the head of it is much more repressive. I don't know what nicer way to say it. Censorial. There's video surfaced of her complaining about free speech.
Well, there's this video out in the last couple of days where she essentially says the truth is not actually the thing that we want to do. That's like a distraction, not even a second tier issue, but something that can actually harm whatever the project is supposed to be, right?
Well, it's absolutely shocking. And what's so interesting about this character, the CEO, is that, or I think it's Maher is her last name, Maher. What's so shocking about it is that she has all of that sort of cultural, for lack of a better term, wokeism or censorial kind of campus censorship culture style. But her training is in these elite establishment institutions, including basically state institutions, which include, the Atlantic Council and other groups that are really very tied to the military-industrial complex and are funded and often by the State Department. So I find that marriage very concerning. So I do see I think that the legacy media are in a vicious downward spiral. On the one hand, they're losing trust and they're losing readers and they're losing advertisers. They had a huge wave of layoffs last year. Their base, though, of their audience is itself more dogmatic and wants to have their views reinforced, so that they end up reinforcing this downward spiral of diminishing trust and diminishing audience share. I think that this trend among younger people to have greater trust in independent media and social media is incredibly positive and is a counter trend to the more censorial nature. So I think that we're in a dangerous period in the sense that we're in between regimes. We've got a kind of dying legacy regime, and we've got new independent media that are really undercapitalized, and we don't have the resources to do the kind of reporting we want to do. So I think on one hand, it's a golden age of journalism. There's a lot of stories that are not being covered that we are covering, and we're excited to cover. And we're recruiting, people that can do that kind of investigative journalism. But we don't have the resources yet to be able to compete with the big legacy media. So often we do end up still depending on the legacy media And I have a very ambivalent relationship with them. On the one hand, we did a report where we had some leaked files around so-called gender medicine, and we took them to the Times of London, the Telegraph, the Economist, Washington Post, and they all did stories. And I think it helped with the story. In Brazil, the mainstream news media were actually a hindrance to getting the truth out, and they continue to basically, if I'm being blunt about it, I think lie or misrepresent seriously biased stories about what are actually in the Twitter files and what's been happening.
Right. Michael, if you were a young person today, and let's go back a little bit to the demand, the cancel culture, outside of the government. If you're a young person in this hostile environment where only one opinion is the right opinion, there's a fashionable point of view, and if you don't hold it, then you're the unwashed. What steps can you take? How can you engage in the world as a young person who is seeking the truth in that environment? What advice would you have for a young person? Because I noticed in all the horrible battles that you've had to fight, you've managed to maintain your composure. You put things in a reasonable way.
Thank you.
There's a civility about your work. How do you maintain that, and what advice would you give to young people?
Well, it's such a good question. So I think for people that are interested in being researchers or investigators or journalists, and you can do that as an academic or as a freelancer, journalism used to really not be required to have a college degree at all. There's a couple of things that are super important. The first is to be skeptical of all of your sources, that's not something that's unique to either independent voices or governmental sources. Just to give a sense of it, FBI is who we rely on for crime data. I spent a lot of time with FBI crime data to do my second book, San Francisco, and it's a mess. There's a lot of problems with the data. And Roland Fryer from Harvard, who was here recently, talked a lot about how they had to go do data. So even especially official sources, you have to always know exactly how the data is being created. Data, and that even sounds funny, but to quantify something, somebody's counting some phenomenon. Since lived reality is just not numbered, the numbers are what we're doing to it. So I think it's that incredible skepticism is the first thing. The second thing is a view of the truth as plural, and the need for pluralism. Such a simple but difficult thing to do. Friedrich Nietzsche has a lovely way of describing it, which he says, many eyes, have a view of the truth. So you're trying to triangulate, or you're trying, we sometimes say, get 2 or 3 sources for that. Or if I'm doing a really controversial story, it will be like, let's get 3 or 4 sources, but never single source as a journalist. And then as a scholar or as somebody working on academic research, you just want to verify these things. And then I say that maybe the third part of it is to just be transparent about your research methods. I really have declining and low confidence in anybody who wants to keep a secret of what their methods were. In fact, we saw this scandal with the former president of Harvard who wasn't completely transparent about it. Much better to just be open and transparent about it. And I think you should be looking to see if they're telling you exactly, where their information is coming from, how they got it, even if they can't reveal the name of the person, because we do also use anonymous sources. I think it's important. But at least you can say these people are in these institutions, or they're in some way to know.
It's interesting, the Nietzsche quote, many different eyes on the truth. And I think one of the great risks is perhaps a misinterpretation or a misrepresentation of that spirit, in that it's very common now today to hear that there can be many truths. And I think the disposition of some, rather than to really healthily aggregate from the many eyes, is to pick one that best suits their purposes, and to sort of propagandize it for themselves. How do you address that problem of relativism? The NPR example is a case in point. Literally saying that it doesn't matter. But if we can kind of, argue a little bit and land on, what's comfortable, then that might be better than the truth. How do you see the problem of relativism in the world today?
I do think it's a huge problem. And I think that when you say use many eyes, you're not saying give all of them equal credence. Right. And you're also not saying that they're all weighted the same way, or that one of them is reliable across time. I mean, there's unreliable people can provide you with reliable information, and reliable people can provide you with highly unreliable information. Right. And so true research where you're really getting to the bottom of it has to be, I think you have to just report it out for yourself to be an original source. And we need more true investigators, true researchers. I think the world has far too many commentators who are giving their opinion about other people's reporting. I'm just shocked at how often we will break a story and it will be pretty major outlets that will then sort of pick it up and repeat it. And I'm kind of like, okay, but we need more people to do some more of that original research. I do think it's also important, though, to acknowledge that other people, when people say they have their own truths, I think it's important to understand what those are. And so you can explain them and understand them. And then finally, the other piece I would just add to it, as a practice, as a practical matter, in your writing and in your research, address the other point of view. That's the simplest way to do it. In debate, of course, we take positions that we don't agree with, and we are able to argue both sides. When we do stories, I like to have somewhere towards the top, often in the third paragraph, the caveat, the criticism. I like to anticipate what would I, as a reasonable person reading this article, raise as a skeptical question at this point in the article. And I'll try to do that a couple of times towards the top of the article and then towards the end, because I do think you want to build that into, if you're going to make a strong argument, it's because you've addressed all of the potential objections and caveats.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the great things that we're going to do with our kids here when they come in is insist upon the art of great writing. And the art of great writing includes the ability to synthesize your arguments properly, to actually state what the objections are, what the strengths are. And I think that's a very good litmus test. What would a reasonable person addressing an argument in an essay expect that a reasonable objection would be? And you don't need to necessarily go down the path of, completely entertaining a ridiculous view to see how it might be able to usefully shape the truth of the argument that's leading you to the truth, right?
No, and indeed arguing against an easily dismissible argument is a straw man. And so what you want to do is the steel man. You want to take the strongest part. So, I mean, we tend to start our articles by repeating the conventional wisdom as is in the mainstream news media. And then the second paragraph, debunking it and writing the criticism of it. But in the third paragraph, giving that conventional wisdom a chance to respond before then responding to that. And so our story, to be a story, the reader goes on a journey. In the classic hero's journey story, you're going somewhere. So at the end of the story, you're in a different place than you were at the beginning. Now, to some extent, you're coming back to the beginning of the story because you're reflecting on where you've come from. But you've really gone through a whole journey, and it should be quite a journey. There should be quite an adventure that you're leading the reader on. But you're definitely on a single journey, and I think that's the difference between having one story or multiple stories, is that, and sometimes that's why the scope has to change, but you do need, I think, to really engage in that journey with the readers. Yeah.
Well, one of the first books that we're going to get our students here to read is The Odyssey.
Classic.
Which, Odysseus is by turns heroic and by turns confounded by what he faces. And I wonder, in all of your adventures, maybe the Twitter files would be a good example, or another you can think of. Have you recently been just completely surprised or confounded by the journey that your investigation has taken? You think you're, going down one path, and the story has turned into something, way deeper than you could ever have imagined.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely the case of the censorship work, where we thought it was just a cultural a cancel
Right.
culture phenomenon, and
Right.
then we realized there was all these governmental actors, and that then led to a bunch of questions about, well, when you sort of, even when you say, well, it's these governmental actors, but in some ways, institutions, not in some ways, it's true, institutions and government agencies are comprised of people, and those people are created by the culture. And so I'm very interested in what happens when institutions get taken over by people that are in the grip of a very powerful ideology, and then the institutions end up doing things that are actually the opposite of what they were supposed to be doing. So you would see the FBI engaged in actually creating criminal activity,
Right.
particularly entrapment, in order to achieve a particular political objective.
So this was a really interesting moment, right? I'm thinking when Mark Zuckerberg went on Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan's not necessarily the person running this story, but because the debate is alive in the public sphere, he talks to Zuckerberg and out pops this line, "Oh, the FBI called us," and that was kind of like a what the hell moment, right? And I think that's surely got to be one of those discoveries that are an open market for ideas and discussion can bring us.
Well, right, and it's also it's such a great moment too, because I remember seeing it and kind of going, "Oh, that's interesting," because I think it was during the summer of 2022.
Right.
Well, then I get into the Twitter files in December of 2022, and we discover the aha moment was Aspen Institute had held a workshop
Right.
in August of 2020 to basically pre-bunk the Hunter Biden laptop story, which would not be published for another couple months. And the whole purpose of this briefing was to train reporters how not to cover a story, and suggesting that anything that would come out about Hunter Biden and his family business dealings would be a Russian hack and leak operation. Well, the Hunter Biden laptop came out. There's zero evidence that it was a Russian hack and leak operation. But yet here you had all these former CIA directors who said so publicly. And then you have former FBI officials within Twitter who basically changed the whole company position. They had looked at the Hunter Biden story in the New York Post in mid-October 2020, and they said, this doesn't violate our terms of service. There's no evidence that it's false. There's no evidence it was a result of hacking, and there's no evidence that it was a result of Russians. And yet you still had these former FBI officials inside of Twitter insisting that it should nonetheless be censored, which it was. So that was a moment where, and then when I did that, I think that was in January 2023 that I ended up doing the Twitter files thread on the Hunter Biden laptop. And I actually pulled that Mark Zuckerberg clip with Joe Rogan, because it was like,
right.
It's those things as stories go where you're like, there will be something that happens, but you don't know how it fits into a story until you have more information.
Right. Let me ask you, the Russian interference is a really good example of this. So many people would, that's just kind of a held opinion now, right? That there was this sort of nefarious plot, and that Russian agents were all over this. Do you think that lies can pass into history, or is there a sense that the truth will always out? I mean, when we look back in the thousands and thousands of years of recorded human history, is it your sense that there may be great fallacies lurking there? And when you see issues like this today, does that kind of give you pause that man, maybe there's some really big mistruths that we just, even with all the tools of the First Amendment and all the tools of our truth-seeking instincts, they're just going to pass unnoticed into the record books?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure there's things that we understand from history that are completely wrong.
Right.
At the same time, I also really do have I think I have newfound respect for the historian's profession and for that discipline, because, you start to get, first of all, I love the appreciation that the discipline has for written documents. Of course, there's forgeries. Of course, there's things that can be misinterpreted, but we know human memory is so fallible, and written documents are just, and they're obviously prioritized in journalism as well. And so things do come out over time, and I'm struck by how many of the political actors that I'm tracking who are engaged in efforts to demand more censorship, they're very focused on the short term. Like they're not really worried about where this is going to shake out in history. And I think you see them do things where it appears that they're demonstrating awareness that at some point they're going to be caught. In the world of intelligence, this is known as a limited hangout, where the agencies will find some way to reveal some aspect of the operation, of a secret operation. It's almost like the public relations or the public communications of a secret operation, so that if or when they're caught, they can say, well, no, we said that here in this situation. Of course, it was on a YouTube video that only 200 people saw. It was not listed on YouTube. But it's enough. It's or another way. We call it a cover your ass kind of activity. Yeah. So we do see some of that, and I think things do come out more. I'm actually sometimes I'm pessimistic about safetyism and this desire to protect people from words that are clearly not words that are threatening words or incitement words. I feel more optimistic that when we actually can document the censorship activities and call them censorship, which turns out to just be a kind of kryptonite for some of these operations, because they call them, this is about hate speech, it's about fighting misinformation. So when you go, well, actually, you're engaged in censorship, things really do change. And so in Brazil, I started my time there just being viciously slandered in the news media. Horrible things were being said that were not true, and claims of conspiracies between me and Elon Musk and this global cabal. I mean, it was really crazy. Literally the day I left, the two largest newspapers in the country came out and said, we shouldn't have this kind of censorship that is being documented here, and often it's very much like how proud people admit they were wrong. They kind of mumble through it and they assert the principle. But I left feeling like, okay, we actually know how to at least, if not completely remove, at least do serious damage to the censorship industrial complex. And it's pretty straightforward. It's just exposing it for what it is and then explaining to people why censorship is bad. And in almost all cases, save a very small number of cases that most people are happy to have it. Yeah.
Do you think that we're entering a time where we're going to need to see even greater acts of bravery to tell the truth? I mean, we can look back at the 20th century and look at how many people in a gulag or a concentration camp faced the choice of, yes, I need to speak the truth, but it looks like it's an absolute futility. Do you sense that we're entering a time where, indeed, a lot of people who want to speak the truth, maybe not going to face such extreme conditions and consequences, but that this is a long battle ahead?
Yeah, I do. I feel like I'm in an optimistic place right now because of the Brazil thing. I did also see that courage is contagious. Cowardice is contagious too, but courage is also contagious. So the Twitter files, Elon Musk, we saw people doing things that they were too scared to do beforehand, releasing documents they weren't supposed to release, making criticisms that they were scared to make. And I've even have a whistleblower who had been confidential who now says that they want to be public. So I think you start to see that, and then. I think one of the things, I think a lot of people have had this experience themselves personally, but I've seen it in other people, which is that they tell the truth and there's it's a sense of relief and also a sense of real joy that they've sort of survived the speaking out, and that they may have to leave their job or they may face some other consequences, but there is true liberation that comes from being able to speak the truth after having been too scared to speak it for a long time. Right.
Yeah, I think that's what we really want for our students here is, I would hope that they would get to the place where, even in the worst material circumstances, like you lose your job or, a bunch of fashionable people hate you, that they understand that that's what's at stake, right? It's not just that you follow the rules or that, you achieve some outcome for the betterment of society. It's a personal thing. Human beings kind of need to tell the truth. And if they don't, then you're almost guaranteed to go down a path that is going to lead to pain and angst and anxiety for you, right?
Absolutely. And I think that I want to emphasize the value of truth for its own sake. I believe in that. But I also do want to also help people know that there are also societal rewards for telling the truth. I once had somebody accuse me. They were sort of like, well, you made a whole career out of, renouncing your previous views. And I was like, well, that's great. I mean, part of my two books, Apocalypse Never in San Francisco, in both of them I look back onto views that I once held and then explain first why I changed my mind, and then also why I held the views in the first place. It's incredibly powerful because, first of all, you avoid having to criticize somebody else so that people don't get defensive. You're talking about yourself, and you're the expert in yourself. I also think that it's incredibly healthy to be able to get some of that distance from your own views. I think I know what was going on for myself internally better than I know for somebody else. And then also I know where some of my own true weaknesses are, or failings or tendencies. I mean, I have a tendency towards wishful thinking. I'm saying this right after saying I've been optimistic. I have a tendency towards wishful thinking. I think some of it is probably genetic. I see it in my father, and I see it in myself. And now you can go the other way too, where you can engage in defensive pessimism, where you're just pessimistic about everything, then your heart's never broken. I love soccer, and so there's an expression in soccer which is optimism on the offensive, pessimism on the defense. I think that's a pretty good way to think of it. Of course, the problem in reality is you don't know when you're on the offensive and when you're on the defensive. But I do know that about myself, that I do have some tendencies towards wishful thinking, and I can now train myself a little bit more to say, am I engaging in wishful thinking in this case? Do I really have the evidence that things are getting better, or am I just wishing that they were?
Right. But you're pointing to a really important quality here, and that's self-knowledge. If I look out at the university system and young people in general, I don't see an environment that is equipped to lead people to better self-knowledge. I mean, that is at the heart of what we're trying to do here at the University of Austin. We want to give you the kind of education where it's not just about knowing things about the world and historical facts and places and stories. You learn those stories because they should lead you to a greater understanding of yourself. And if you really do understand yourself, then you're in a position to critique like that. A lot of these, sensorial types, are suffering from a poor quality of soul. It's a lack of self-knowledge. What do you think went into your life? Like, what is the ingredient in Michael Shellenberger that allowed you to, live in San Francisco and not succumb to all of its intellectual vices? What do you think went into you that makes you like that?
Sure, and before answering that, I did want to address that. Actually, there have been studies done of people that want to censor other people and what's going on for them. And it's sort of what you would imagine. They don't think that they would ever be a victim of censorship.
Right.
And so I ask reporters that. I did in Sao Paulo. I said, what have you said that you think the government should have censored? They've never thought of it.
Right,
I mean, that's
right.
the truth of it. They've never given thought to that, and that's a kind of, I guess you could call it a kind of narcissism, but it's a kind of self-blindness. It's sometimes called third-party effect, where you only imagine things happening to other people, never to yourself. And some of that's being young, and I was much more like that in my own youth. I guess my own situation is it was probably, I think some of it is personality. There is, the big five personality, which is, openness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, and then, I think I would say I've got qualities of an entrepreneur in the sense of being higher, low on agreeableness. I try to be a civil person and a polite person and a kind person, but the haste with which people will agree, I've never had. I've always been a little bit more skeptical, a little bit more critical. And then I think the other one is actually open. So I'm pretty open to being, I mean, I think I've made some mistakes by being too open-minded. And, there's a famous expression, if you're so open-minded that your brains fall out, that's not good either. But I think just those natural combinations of openness and some amount of and low on agreeableness, I think explain a fair amount. I do love people. I love new experiences. I mean, that's part of the openness. I like traveling.
Mm-hmm.
I really think you can't understand things unless you go there. So I've always tried to do that. But there's been a lot of, I've had the most painful part of it all has just been the loss of friendships. And
Right,
so
I'm sure,
I think, it's not something I recommend to anybody, but there are sacrifices that you make if you're really pursuing the truth. And sometimes it can be relationships, which are in some ways, if you listen to a lot of philosophy, you go, life is really about your relationships. So that's not a obvious or pleasant sacrifice to have to make.
Right. So Michael, maybe to close, when you look out at all the work you do, people you meet, and the world you inhabit, what are you most pessimistic about, and what are you most optimistic about?
I guess I would say that I'm most pessimistic about the safetyism
Right.
among younger generations and the distorting effect that social media has had, and because I see it not just in the cancel culture. I'm worried that you're starting to see it in institutions, and sort of relatedly, I'm worried when I see institutions taken over by people that are clearly not motivated by the public interest or the interest of those institutions to heal or to keep people safe or to get the truth out, and often end up being quite the opposite. I think my optimism is that I already see some corrections to all of those phenomenon. So we see this important book by Jonathan Haidt talking about the perils of social media and the need to protect children from that, and the need to change the culture. And I think it's a best-selling. I think it's number one, and clearly I think it's definitely going to have an impact on parenting culture and hopefully allowing kids to have more of that, free play or even dangerous levels of play, not too dangerous, but some amount of danger. And then I think also some awareness that these institutions that we had relied upon for, security, truth, education, had been corrupted, and I see people creating new institutions. That's why I'm so excited to be at the University of Austin, and so excited to be a part of a new breed of journalists who are, I think, taking advantage of the new technologies to create new truth-seeking and truth-telling organizations.
Fantastic. Well, Michael, many wise people have said it's if you look at the people who are doing the censoring, they rarely turn out to be the good guys. Conversely, I would say the people fighting against censorship probably are the good guys. We definitely know that you are one of the best guys, and we're really, honestly, really honored to have you involved here at the university with our students. Very, very excited about the kind of wisdom that you can bring to them as they develop their own compass for truth, for free speech, for doing what's right. And I want to thank you for coming and talking to us again today. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here.